Let's work on an application on money creation. Similar to the one to the applications posted for you on Canvas. So let's take a simple balance sheet for a bank, assets, liabilities, and suppose we have reserves. For this bank, reserves equals $300,000. And suppose this bank has loans outstanding $800,000. And then suppose the transaction accounts on liability side is $1 million. So using the data from this balance sheet, let's try to answer some typical questions. Suppose one question is, given the data on this for this bank, and given that Federal Reserve System requires the bank to have a required reserve ratio of 10% of the transaction accounts, the question is, how much is the excess reserve that this bank has? Excess reserve, sometimes it refers to in the applications as increase in loans that this bank can have. So in other words, whatever excess reserve the bank has can provide more loans in addition to the existing ones, in our case $800,000 over here. So let's see how we think about this application. If you go and look back on the formulas for the money creation, we have any bank has to have a required reserve in dollars, defined as required reserve ratio in percentage times the transaction account. So let's see how much this bank is going to have a required reserve. My required reserve ratio is 10% times my transaction accounts are $1 million. So 10% times $1 million is $100,000. This is how much money they are required to have at all times. Now, how do we find out the excess reserves? Well, the excess reserve is whatever reserve the bank has minus the required reserve. In our case, the bank has $300,000 as a reserve over here. 300,000 minus, we just solve for required reserve 100,000. So we have excess reserve for this bank is going to be 200,000. So this bank can increase its loans by 200,000. This is how we interpret. Now let's work on a similar application. Now suppose we keep the same data that we had before. Let's write it down again. Asset, liabilities, reserve was 300,000. Loans was 800,000. Liabilities, transaction accounts is $1 million. So suppose the question is another question. How much is the increase in the lending in the whole banking system? How much is the increase in lending or lending capacity in the whole banking system? Whenever you see this wording, banking system, it refers to the increase in the money available in the whole banking, not just by this one bank that we are given this data. And from the theory, you know that whenever a bank lends its excess reserve, it's going to go via loans to other bank, and this bank makes more loans. And this is how we have an increase through the banking system. And this question involves you working with the money multiplier as well. And in this case, suppose that Fed, let's change it a little bit. Fed requires the banks to have a required reserve ratio of 20% rather than 10%. So let's see how we find the increase in lending in the whole banking system. First, we calculate the required reserve in dollars. Is required reserve ratio, this case is 20, times transaction deposit, transaction accounts that are a million. So in this case, this one bank is required to have $200,000 at all times. Now let's see how much the excess reserve we have for a required reserve ratio of 20% in this case. So the excess reserve is going to be my actual reserve, 300,000, minus the required reserve, 200,000. So that's going to be 100,000 excess reserve. Now through the whole banking system, we are going to have a money multiplier defined as 1 divided by required reserve ratio. So 1 divided by 0.20, so that's going to be 5. So in simple words, the money is going to multiply 5 times through the banking system. And finally, increase in lending in the whole capacity in the whole banking system is going to be excess reserve times the money multiplier. My excess reserve was 100,000 times 5. So that's going to be 500,000. So that was an application on money creation. So we can continue and work on the other applications posted for you.